Sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest disappointments. Frank Collins learned this truth on a Tuesday evening when his heart was breaking from 3 hours of waiting alone. The 52-year-old mechanic sat outside Murphy's cafe, watching couples walk by while his date never showed. His gas station flowers were wilting in his hands. After his divorce, finding love again felt impossible. He was ready to give up on romance forever. Then a little girl with tears in her eyes ran up to him. "Are you waiting for the pretty lady?" she asked. When Frank nodded, she grabbed his hand. "My mommy needs someone good like you." Frank followed her home and discovered something that would change his life in ways he never expected. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Collins had always been a man of routine. Every morning at 6:30, he'd shuffle into his small kitchen, brew coffee in the same chipped mug his son Danny had made in third-grade pottery class, and listen to the local news while buttering toast that was always one shade too dark. The mug bore a lopsided handle and the words "World's Best Dad" in fading blue letters, a reminder of simpler times when his biggest worry was whether Danny had finished his homework. His apartment above Collins Auto Repair reflected the methodical nature of a man who fixed things for a living. Tools had their designated places, bills were filed in order of importance, and the refrigerator held exactly what he needed for the week ahead. No more, no less. The walls displayed Danny's school photos, from kindergarten through high school graduation. A timeline of a boy growing into a man while Frank learned to be a father on his own. The divorce from Linda had been finalized 3 years ago, though their marriage had been over long before the papers were signed. She'd wanted adventure, spontaneity, a life that stretched beyond the grease-stained confines of small-town predictability. Frank had wanted stability, family dinners around the kitchen table, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Neither was wrong, but together they'd been incompatible in ways that took 15 years to fully understand. "You're a good man, Frank," Linda had said during their last conversation as a married couple. "But you're not the man I married anymore." She was right, of course. The Frank she'd married at 25 had dreams of expanding the garage, maybe opening a second location, traveling to car shows across the country. But responsibility had a way of reshaping dreams into something more practical, more immediate. Danny's needs, the mortgage, the daily demands of keeping a small business afloat, these things had gradually worn away the rough edges of ambition until what remained was solid, dependable, and thoroughly unremarkable. Now, at 52, Frank's toolbox represented more than just his livelihood. The red metal case, scarred from decades of use, contained instruments that could diagnose problems, repair what was broken, and restore function to things others might discard as hopeless. Inside, every wrench, screwdriver, and gauge had earned its place through proven utility. Frank approached life the same way, methodically, patiently, believing that most problems could be solved with the right tools and enough time to understand what had gone wrong. His friend Bobby Martinez had been trying to convince him to start dating again for the better part of 2 years. "Come on, Frank," Bobby would say while picking up his truck after an oil change. "You're not getting any younger, and there's plenty of good women out there who'd appreciate a guy like you." Bobby owned the hardware store down the street and seemed to know everyone in town, including several recently divorced women he was convinced would be perfect for Frank. "I'm fine on my own," Frank would reply, focusing intently on whatever engine he happened to be working on. And he was fine mostly. He had his work, his weekly dinners with Danny when his son wasn't too busy with his own life, and the comfortable solitude of evening television and early bedtimes. It wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful. And after the tumultuous final years with Linda, peace felt like luxury. But Bobby was persistent in the way that only old friends can be. Last month, he'd cornered Frank during the lunch rush at Rosie's diner. "There's this woman, Susan," he'd said, sliding into the booth across from Frank. "She works at the insurance office. Recently divorced, nice lady, about your age. I told her about you." Frank had nearly choked on his coffee. You told her what about me? That you're decent, hard-working, not an axe murderer, the basics. Bobby grinned. She said she'd be interested in meeting you. Nothing serious, just coffee or dinner. What do you say? The word no had been forming on Frank's lips when he caught sight of his reflection in the diner's window. Grey hair thinning at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years, squinting at engine problems, work shirts that had seen better decades. When was the last time he'd looked forward to anything beyond the next oil change or brake job? Coffee, he'd said finally. Just coffee, and so it was arranged. Susan from the insurance office, Tuesday evening at Murphy's Cafe. Frank had spent the weekend in a state of mild panic, wondering what people talked about on first dates when they were old enough to have mortgages and grown children. Linda had been his high school sweetheart. They'd learned about love together, fumbling through courtship with the graceless enthusiasm of teenagers. At 52, he felt even less prepared for romance than he had at 17. He'd driven to the mall on Monday afternoon, a journey that felt as foreign as space travel. The department store's fluorescent lights revealed the sorry state of his wardrobe. Work shirts, jeans, and the one suit he wore to weddings and funerals. A young salesperson with earnest eyes and a name tag reading Trevor had helped him select a button-down shirt in what Trevor called a sophisticated navy and Frank called and not too fancy. Tuesday evening found Frank standing in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of his new shirt for the 15th time. His hands, no matter how thoroughly scrubbed, still bore the permanent stains of his profession, small crescents of grease beneath his nails, calluses that spoke of decades spent gripping tools and wrestling with stubborn bolts. He'd given up trying to completely erase these marks of his trade. They were part of who he was, and any woman worth knowing would have to accept that. The drive to Murphy's Cafe took 8 minutes, but Frank stretched it to 15 by taking the long way through downtown. The evening air carried the scent of late summer, cut grass, barbecue smoke from backyard grills, and the faint exhaust of rush-hour traffic. Murphy's Cafe occupied a corner building that had housed everything from a barber shop to a used bookstore over the decades. Now it served decent coffee and homemade pie to a clientele that included everyone from college students to retirees, killing time between doctor's appointments. Frank had arrived 20 minutes early, clutching the bouquet he'd purchased from the convenience store down the street. The flowers were simple, daisies and carnations wrapped in cellophane, but they seemed appropriate for a first meeting. Too elaborate might suggest expectations he wasn't ready to have. Too simple might seem thoughtless. He'd settled on modest and sincere, qualities that had served him well in most areas of his life. The outdoor seating area offered a view of the street and the comforting anonymity of being just another person watching the world go by. Frank chose a table near the sidewalk where Susan would be sure to spot him and arranged the flowers carefully beside his coffee cup. He'd worn his watch, the reliable Timex. Danny had given him for Father's Day 5 years ago and found himself checking it with increasing frequency as 7 o'clock approached. 7:15 came and went. Frank told himself that traffic could be unpredictable, that finding parking downtown sometimes required several attempts. He ordered a second coffee and watched couples stroll past, hand in hand, comfortable in their shared rhythms. A young family emerged from the ice cream shop across the street, the father carrying a toddler while the mother pushed a stroller, their conversation punctuated by the child's delighted laughter. By 8 o'clock, Frank had consumed 3 cups of coffee and read the same newspaper twice. The evening crowd was thinning, couples finishing their dinners and heading home to more intimate conversations. The flowers beside his cup had begun to droop slightly, their cheerful faces now seeming to mock his patient optimism. 8:30, 9 o'clock. The server, a kind woman named Grace, who'd been working at Murphy's for as long as Frank could remember, approached his table with gentle concern. "Can I get you anything else, honey?" she asked, her eyes taking in the wilted flowers and Frank's increasingly slumped posture. "I think I'm done here," Frank replied, his voice carrying the weight of wounded pride and the dull ache of disappointment. He left a generous tip, Grace wasn't responsible for his evening's failure and gathered his flowers with as much dignity as he could manage. The walk to his truck felt longer than usual. Frank moved slowly, processing the reality of being stood up and what it meant about his readiness to re-enter the world of romance. Perhaps Bobby had been wrong about Susan's interest. Perhaps Frank had misunderstood something crucial about the arrangement. Or perhaps, at 52, with his grease-stained hands and unremarkable life, he simply wasn't the kind of man women noticed anymore. He was fumbling with his keys, the flowers tucked awkwardly under one arm, when he heard the sound of running footsteps on the sidewalk behind him. The little girl couldn't have been more than 5 years old, her dark hair escaping from what had once been neat pigtails. Dirt streaked her cheek, and her small chest rose and fell rapidly, as if she'd been running for blocks. She wore a faded purple dress that had seen better days and sneakers with mismatched laces, one red, one blue. "Mister, are you the man who was waiting for the pretty lady?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight lisp that made her words sound both urgent and endearing. Frank blinked, momentarily confused by this unexpected interruption to his evening of rejection. "I was waiting for someone, yes, but she didn't come." The child's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them away with the fierce determination that only children possess. "My mommy said God would send someone good to help us. She said to look for a man with kind eyes who was waiting alone." She studied Frank's face with the intensity of someone much older. "You have kind eyes." Before Frank could formulate a response, the little girl reached out and took his much larger hand in both of hers. Her skin was soft but slightly sticky, the way children's hands always seem to be. "Please, mister, will you come with me? My mommy is sick and she needs help." Every instinct Frank possessed told him to be cautious. He didn't know this child, had no idea what situation he might be walking into, and the responsible thing would be to find a police officer or call social services. But something in the girl's eyes, a combination of desperate hope and premature wisdom, made him hesitate. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, crouching down to her level. "Emma Rodriguez. I live 3 blocks away with my mommy. She's been sick for a long time and today she got worse." Emma's lower lip trembled. She couldn't get up from the couch and she was really hot and breathing funny. "I was scared, so I came looking for help." Frank's parental instincts, honed through years of caring for Danny, kicked into overdrive. "Where's your daddy, Emma?" "I don't have one. It's just me and Mommy." She tugged on his hand. "Please," she said, "if I found the right person, they would help us." "Are you the right person?" The question hung in the evening air like a challenge from the universe itself. Frank looked down at this small girl who had somehow found him in his moment of deepest disappointment and seen something worth trusting. His practical mind catalogued all the reasons to politely decline. He didn't know these people. It could be dangerous. It wasn't his responsibility. But his heart, the part of him that had spent 3 years learning to function around a constant ache of loneliness, recognized something in Emma's plea that resonated with his own need to matter to someone. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go check on your mother." Emma's face transformed with relief, so profound that Frank felt his chest tighten. She led him down 3rd Street, past the used bookstore and the laundromat, where a few late customers watched their clothes tumble in the fluorescent-lit machines. Their destination was a narrow 3-story building sandwiched between a beauty salon and a corner market, its brick facade showing decades of wear and neglect. Emma pulled him through a door that opened directly onto a steep staircase. The hallway smelled of cooking spices, old wood, and the faint mustiness that came with age, and too many people living in too small a space. They climbed to the 2nd floor, where Emma stopped at apartment 2B and pushed open a door that had been left unlocked. "Mommy, I brought help," Emma called out as they entered. The apartment was tiny, a living room that doubled as a kitchen, with a bathroom and what Frank assumed was a bedroom visible through partially open doors. But despite its size, the space was clean and organized, with the care of someone who took pride in what little they had. Children's drawings covered one wall, and a small table held a few framed photos and a wilted plant that someone was trying desperately to keep alive. On a threadbare couch that had been converted into a makeshift bed lay a young woman who couldn't have been much older than Danny. Her long dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, and even from across the room, Frank could hear her labored breathing. The coffee table beside her was covered with papers, bills, medical forms, prescription bottles, and other documents that told a story of someone struggling to stay afloat. "Mommy, this is the nice man I told you about," Emma said, rushing to the couch and taking her mother's hand. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and Frank found himself looking into a face that, despite obvious illness and exhaustion, possessed a quiet beauty. Her skin had an unhealthy pallor, but her eyes held the same determination he'd seen in Emma's. "I'm sorry," she whispered, trying to sit up and failing. "Emma, you shouldn't have bothered this man. I told you to stay inside." Frank stepped forward, his flowers forgotten in his other hand. "Ma'am, I'm Frank Collins. Your daughter was worried about you, and rightly so. You look like you need medical attention. I can't afford—" she began, then stopped, shame coloring her pale cheeks. "I'm Maya Rodriguez. Thank you for walking Emma home, but we'll be fine." It was a lie spoken with the desperate pride of someone who had been managing alone for too long. Frank had heard that same tone in his own voice during the difficult months after Linda left. When well-meaning friends offered help, he couldn't bring himself to accept. "Ma'am, you have a fever that looks dangerous, and your breathing is concerning. When did you last see a doctor?" Maya's laugh was bitter and short. 3 weeks ago. They said I had pneumonia, gave me antibiotics. But I had to choose between filling the prescription and buying groceries." She gestured weakly toward the scattered papers. "I work 3 jobs, and I still can't keep up." Frank's eyes fell on the medical bills spread across the coffee table. Even upside down, he could see numbers that would be daunting for someone with his steady income, let alone a single mother working multiple jobs. The prescription bottle sitting empty beside them bore yesterday's date and Maya's name. "Mommy, will you marry this nice man?" Emma asked suddenly, her 5-year-old logic cutting straight to what seemed like an obvious solution. "Then he could take care of you when you're sick." Both adults froze. Maya's eyes filled with tears of mortification, while Frank felt heat rise in his cheeks. But Emma continued with the relentless innocence of childhood. "He has kind eyes, and he came when I asked for help. And he's got pretty flowers. You always said if someone brought you flowers, they must be nice." Frank looked down at the wilted bouquet still clutched in his hand, gas station flowers that had been meant for a woman who never came, now somehow perfect for this moment of unexpected human connection. "Emma, honey," Maya managed, "you can't just ask people to marry strangers. This gentleman has his own life." But as Frank knelt beside the couch, something shifted inside his chest. It was need he could address, problems his hands could solve, a small family that wasn't asking for anything more than basic human kindness. For the first time in 3 years, he felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with alternators or brake pads. "These are for you," he said quietly, offering Maya the flowers. "And Emma's right about one thing. You need someone to take care of you right now. At least until you're better." Maya stared at the flowers as if they were something miraculous, her tired eyes brimming with tears she was too proud to shed. In that moment, Frank understood that his evening of disappointment had led him exactly where he was meant to be. Frank returned to Maya's apartment the next morning with grocery bags that told a story of careful consideration. He'd stopped at the pharmacy first, consulting with the pharmacist about Maya's prescription, and learning that the antibiotics she needed would cost $67, money that might as well have been $67,000 for someone choosing between medicine and food. He'd paid without hesitation, adding a bottle of children's fever reducer and throat lozenges that tasted like cherry. The grocery store had required more thought. Frank was accustomed to shopping for one, occasionally 2 when Danny visited, and his cart usually contained the predictable bachelor fare of frozen dinners, canned soup, and bread that would last the week. But shopping for a sick woman and a 5-year-old demanded different considerations. He found himself studying nutrition labels, selecting fresh fruits that would tempt a child's appetite, and choosing ingredients for the chicken soup his own mother had made during his childhood illnesses. Emma answered his knock with the enthusiasm of someone who had been watching the window for his arrival. She wore the same purple dress as the night before, though someone had made an attempt to tame her hair into something resembling order. "Mummy, the nice man came back," she called over her shoulder before grabbing Frank's hand and pulling him inside. "I told her you would because you have kind eyes, and kind people keep their promises." Maya was still on the couch, though she'd managed to prop herself into a sitting position and had attempted to straighten the apartment's already tidy appearance. Her fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving her looking less flushed but more fragile, like someone recovering from a long journey. "Mr. Collins, you don't need to," she began, but Frank was already unpacking groceries with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to solving problems through action rather than discussion. "The pharmacy said you should take these with food," he said, placing the antibiotic bottle on the coffee table alongside a container of yogurt. "And Emma, I brought you something special." From one bag, he produced a stuffed rabbit with soft grey fur and a slightly lopsided ear. It wasn't new. Frank had found it at the thrift store next to the pharmacy, where the elderly volunteer had assured him it had been thoroughly cleaned and loved by someone before. Finding its way to the donation pile, Emma received the rabbit with the reverence usually reserved for birthday and Christmas presents. She hugged it to her chest, her small fingers already finding the places where the fur had been worn smooth by previous affection. "What's his name?" Frank asked. "Hopscotch," Emma replied without hesitation, as if the rabbit had been waiting his entire existence for her to recognize his true identity. "He told me." Maya watched this exchange with tears threatening to spill over. "You didn't have to buy her anything. You've already done so much. Everyone needs something to hold on to when they're scared," Frank said simply, remembering Danny's own collection of stuffed animals that had somehow multiplied during the difficult months following the divorce. Besides, Hopscotch was looking lonely at the store. Over the following days, Frank found himself establishing a routine that revolved around apartment 2B. He would open his garage at 7 as usual, work on the scheduled repairs and maintenance that kept his business running, then close at 5 to drive the 3 blocks to Maya's building. Emma would be waiting, her face pressed against the window, and would rush down to help him carry whatever he'd brought that day. Maya's resistance to his help had been eroded gradually, worn down by the practical reality that she couldn't work while sick and couldn't afford not to work while responsible for Emma. Frank had approached her pride with the same patience he brought to diagnosing engine problems, understanding that independence was something that needed to be preserved even in the face of temporary dependence. "I'll pay you back," she said repeatedly during those first few days, and Frank learned to simply nod and change the subject rather than argue. He understood the importance of maintaining dignity even when accepting charity. Maya worked 3 jobs, Frank learned, each one representing a different kind of exhaustion. Mornings at Rosie's Diner, serving coffee and eggs to the early crowd of contractors and office workers grabbing breakfast before long days. Afternoons, cleaning houses for families whose children attended the same school Emma would enter in a few years. Evenings, doing data entry for a medical billing company, hunched over a laptop at her kitchen table, while Emma played quietly nearby or slept in the bedroom they shared. "When do you sleep?" Frank asked one evening, watching her prepare to start her computer work after a 12-hour day that had begun before dawn. "When Emma sleeps," Maya replied with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had long ago stopped thinking of rest as a luxury she could afford. "Usually midnight to 5:30. Frank did quick mental arithmetic and felt something cold settle in his stomach. 5.5 hours of sleep for someone working 3 jobs while raising a child alone and recovering from pneumonia. No wonder her body had finally rebelled. He began taking on small repairs around the apartment, fixing a dripping faucet that had been driving Maya crazy for months, replacing the burnt-out bulb in the bathroom that she hadn't had time to address, tightening cabinet doors that hung crooked on worn hinges. Each task was minor, the kind of thing that would take 10 minutes with the right tools. But Maya's gratitude was disproportionate to the effort involved. "You don't understand," she said, watching him adjust the bathroom door so it would close properly. "I've been looking at that gap for 8 months, knowing I should fix it but never having the time or energy. Now I can use the bathroom without being annoyed 12 times a day." Frank had never considered how the accumulation of small, unfixed problems could wear on someone's spirit. In his own apartment, he addressed issues immediately, partly because he had the tools and knowledge, but mostly because he had the time and mental space to notice them. Maya lived in a constant state of triage, addressing only the most urgent problems, while everything else waited for attention that never came. Emma attached herself to Frank with the intensity that children reserve for adults who pay attention to them. She would sit beside him while he worked, chattering about her day at the neighbor's apartment, where she stayed while Maya worked, her plans for Hopscotch's adventures, and her theories about why grown-ups seem to worry about everything. "Do you have kids?" she asked one afternoon while Frank replaced a loose electrical outlet that had been sparking occasionally. "I have a son named Danny. He's all grown up now, 21 years old. Is he nice like you?" Frank paused in his work, considering the question. Danny was a good young man, but their relationship had been strained since the divorce. Not because of anger or resentment, but because of the awkwardness that comes when the family structure changes and no one is quite sure how to navigate the new dynamic. "He's very nice," Frank said finally, "but he's busy with his own life now. Work friends, figuring out what he wants to do next. Maybe he could be friends with me and Mommy," Emma suggested with the casual generosity of childhood. "We don't have very many friends." It was a throwaway comment from a 5-year-old, but it hit Frank with unexpected force. Maya worked so much that she had no time for social connections, and Emma's world was limited to the neighbor who watched her and the small apartment they shared. Their isolation was as profound as Frank's own, but theirs was born of necessity rather than choice. That evening, as Frank prepared to leave for his own apartment, Emma tugged on his sleeve with unusual seriousness. "Are you going to keep coming back?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Frank knelt to her level, meeting her eyes the way he had learned to do with Danny when conversations mattered. "Do you want me to keep coming back?" "Yes," she whispered. "Mommy smiles more when you're here. And Hopscotch likes you too." From the couch, Maya watched this exchange with an expression Frank couldn't quite read. When he looked at her, she quickly turned her attention to the laptop balanced on her knees, but not before he caught something in her face that looked like hope, tempered by the fear of disappointment. "Then I'll keep coming back," Frank promised Emma, and realized he was making the vow as much to himself as to the little girl who had somehow changed the entire direction of his carefully ordered life. It was while helping Maya organize the papers that perpetually covered her coffee table that Frank discovered the nursing textbooks. They were hidden beneath a stack of medical bills and employment applications, their covers worn from handling, but their pages filled with careful notes in Maya's precise handwriting. Fundamentals of nursing practice, anatomy and physiology, pharmacology for nurses, a complete curriculum for someone who had once harbored dreams larger than serving coffee and cleaning other people's homes. "You're studying to be a nurse?" Frank asked, holding up the pharmacology text and noting the detailed margin notes and highlighted passages. Maya looked up from sorting bills into different piles. Urgent, overdue and impossible, and her face colored with embarrassment. "I was, 2 years ago. Before Emma's father left and everything fell apart." She reached for the books as if to hide them again, but Frank held onto the pharmacology text, flipping through pages that revealed a systematic, intelligent approach to learning. Someone had taken careful notes about drug interactions, dosage calculations, and patient care protocols. This wasn't casual studying. This was the work of someone who had taken their education seriously. "How far along were you when you stopped?" he asked. "Halfway through my second year. I had one more year to go before I could take my licensing exam." Maya's voice carried the particular sadness of abandoned dreams. "I was doing clinical rotations at County General, working in the pediatric ward. I loved it. But when Emma's father disappeared, I couldn't afford tuition and childcare and rent all at the same time." Frank continued reading her notes, impressed by their thoroughness and clarity. "These are really good notes. You understand this material. A lot of good it does me now." Maya gestured toward the bills spread across the table. "Even if I could somehow afford to go back, I'd have to start over. It's been too long." "That's not necessarily true," Frank said, setting the book down carefully. "Schools have programs for people returning after breaks. And your grades, your clinical experience, those don't just disappear." Maya laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Frank, I work 70 hours a week and can barely keep us fed. Nursing school is a full-time commitment. It's impossible." But Frank had spent a lifetime solving problems that other people deemed impossible. Engines that wouldn't start, electrical systems that defied logic, mechanical failures that stumped other mechanics. He approached each challenge with the same methodical patience, breaking complex problems into manageable components. "What if you didn't have to work 70 hours a week?" he asked. "Then we'd be homeless in 2 months. What if someone helped with expenses while you went back to school?" Maya's expression shifted from sadness to something sharper, more defensive. "I'm not looking for a handout, Frank. I'm not some charity case you need to fix." "That's not what I meant." Frank held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I meant, what if you had a partner? Someone who could share the load while you pursued your career?" The word partner hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. They had been dancing around the growing closeness between them for weeks, both afraid to name what was developing in the space between friendship and something deeper. Emma chose that moment to emerge from the bedroom, hopscotch tucked under one arm and a book in her other hand. "Frank, will you read to me? Mommy's too tired, and I want to know what happens to the bunny." Frank found himself on the couch with Emma curled against his side, her small body warm and trusting as he read about a brave rabbit who ventured into a dangerous garden to find food for his family. Maya continued sorting bills at the kitchen table, but he could feel her attention divided between her paperwork and the quiet domestic scene playing out just a few feet away. "The bunny's like Mommy," Emma observed when Frank finished the chapter. "He does scary things to take care of his babies." It was a 5-year-old's observation, but it carried profound truth. Maya did venture into dangerous territory every day, working multiple jobs, sacrificing her health and dreams, taking risks with her own well-being to ensure Emma's survival. Like the rabbit in the story, she was brave in ways that often went unrecognized. "Your mommy is very brave," Frank agreed, looking over at Maya, who had stopped pretending to work and was listening openly now. "I wish she didn't have to be brave all the time," Emma said, with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from innocence. "I wish someone else could be brave too, so Mommy could rest." It was Danny who first met Maya and Emma, 3 weeks after Frank had started his daily visits to apartment 2B. Danny had stopped by the garage unexpectedly, hoping to borrow Frank's truck for a weekend camping trip with friends, and found his father closing early with an energy and purpose that seemed entirely out of character. "Hot date?" Danny asked, noting Frank's clean shirt and the grocery bag in his hand. "Something like that," Frank replied, then realized the evasion sounded ridiculous. "Actually, I've been helping a neighbor." "A woman with a sick daughter." Danny's eyebrows rose. In the 3 years since the divorce, Frank had shown no interest in women, neighbors, or anything that might interrupt his routine of work, solitary dinners, and early bedtimes. "Mind if I meet this neighbor?" Danny asked with the casual tone that meant he was anything but casual about the request. Frank hesitated, protective of the fragile dynamic he'd built with Maya and Emma, but realized that if this relationship was going to develop beyond temporary assistance, his son would need to be part of it. Emma answered the door with her usual enthusiasm, but stopped short when she saw Danny standing beside Frank. At 21, Danny had inherited his mother's height and his father's steady demeanor, but to a 5-year-old, he might have seemed intimidatingly adult. "This is my son Danny," Frank said. "Danny, this is Emma and her mother Maya." Emma studied Danny with the intensity she usually reserved for new picture books or interesting insects. "Are you as nice as your daddy?" she asked finally. Danny laughed, a sound that reminded Frank of easier times when his son's amusement wasn't tinged with the subtle skepticism that had crept into their relationship. "I try to be." "Is that your bunny?" The mention of hopscotch broke the ice completely. Emma launched into an elaborate explanation of Hopscotch's personality, preferences, and the important role he played in protecting their apartment from monsters that might otherwise hide under beds or in closets. Maya emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, and Frank watched his son's face carefully as he took in this woman who had somehow become central to his father's daily routine. Danny was polite but reserved, offering the kind of cautious friendliness he might show to any of Frank's acquaintances. But it was during dinner, a simple meal of spaghetti and meat sauce that Frank had helped prepare, that something shifted. Emma, emboldened by Danny's patient attention to her stories, began treating him like the big brother she'd never had. She showed him her coloring books, asked his opinion on Hopscotch's sleeping arrangements, and insisted he help her build a fort out of couch cushions. "She's going to wear you out," Maya warned Danny, as Emma dragged him toward her architectural project. "I don't mind," Danny replied, and Frank could hear genuine affection in his voice. "She's pretty great," Maya smiled, the first completely unguarded smile Frank had seen from her, and in that moment he could envision a future that included all of them. Not the nuclear family he'd once had with Linda, but something different and equally valuable. A group of people who had found each other through circumstance and chosen to stay together through affection. Later, as Danny helped Emma put the finishing touches on her fort, Frank and Maya found themselves alone in the kitchen, washing dishes and navigating the comfortable silence that had developed between them over weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations. "He's a good young man," Maya said, drying a plate with careful attention. "You raised him well." "He likes you," Frank replied, though he could have said more, that Danny's initial wariness had given way to something approaching approval, that his son seemed more relaxed than Frank had seen him in months, that the evening had felt like the first time in years that Frank's family had expanded rather than contracted. "And Emma clearly adores him," Maya continued. "She's never had anyone like that in her life. Someone who pays attention to her just because she's herself, not because they're paid to watch her." From the living room came the sound of Emma's delighted laughter as Danny declared their fort officially monster-proof. Maya and Frank exchanged a look that carried the weight of unspoken possibility, the chance that their separate, incomplete families might somehow merge into something whole. The old wedding ring box sat in Frank's bedside drawer like a small monument to failure. He'd placed it there 3 years ago, after the divorce papers were signed and Linda had moved out, taking half their shared life with her. The ring inside, a simple gold band worn thin by 15 years of marriage, had become too painful to wear, but too significant to discard. It represented promises that hadn't lasted, dreams that had proven incompatible with reality, and the particular grief that comes from loving someone who no longer loves you back. Frank hadn't opened the box since the day he'd put it away, but now he found himself pulling it from the drawer on a quiet Sunday morning, studying the ring that had once symbolized forever. The gold caught the early light filtering through his bedroom window, reflecting years of shared breakfasts, family vacations, late-night conversations about Danny's future, and the gradual erosion of intimacy that neither he nor Linda had known how to stop. 6 weeks had passed since Emma had led him to apartment 2B, and Frank's life had developed a rhythm he couldn't have imagined during those lonely months after the divorce. His days still began at the garage, but they ended with dinner around Maya's small kitchen table, Emma's chatter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. He'd repaired the apartment's heating system, installed better locks on the doors, and somehow convinced Maya to reduce her work schedule from 3 jobs to 2 by quietly covering the income difference. "You can't keep doing this," Maya had protested when she realized what he'd done. "I won't be dependent on you." "It's not dependence," Frank had replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what to call the arrangement that had evolved between them. "It's partnership." The word felt both too small and too large for what they'd built together. Too small because it couldn't capture the way Emma had started calling him almost daddy, or how Maya's smile could change the entire texture of his day. Too large because neither of them had explicitly acknowledged that their relationship had moved beyond mutual assistance into something that resembled love. Frank closed the ring box and returned it to the drawer. But the questions it raised lingered. Was he ready to love someone again? Was Maya interested in more than practical support and companionship? And perhaps most importantly, was he prepared to be a father figure to Emma, with all the responsibility and potential heartbreak that role entailed? These questions became more pressing as Frank found himself integrated into the small domestic rituals that defined Maya and Emma's life together. Sunday mornings at the farmer's market, where Emma insisted on selecting the bananas herself, and Maya navigated their modest budget with the skill of someone who had learned to make every dollar count. Evening walks around the neighborhood, with Emma skipping ahead while Frank and Maya followed. Their conversation flowing between observations about their daughter's latest enthusiasm and the more serious topics of work, dreams, and the future they were tentatively building together. It was during one of these walks that Frank's phone buzzed with a text from Linda. She was in town for a conference and wanted to have coffee, to catch up and see how you're doing. The message was casual, friendly even, but it stirred emotions Frank thought he'd successfully buried. "Everything okay?" Maya asked, noticing his sudden distraction. Frank showed her the message, watching her face carefully for signs of jealousy or insecurity. Instead, he saw something more complex, a flicker of understanding mixed with concern that had nothing to do with possessiveness and everything to do with genuine care for his emotional well-being. "Do you want to see her?" Maya asked. It was the kind of question that revealed character. A less secure woman might have discouraged the meeting or demanded details about his feelings for his ex-wife. Maya simply waited for his honest answer, prepared to support whatever decision would be best for him. "I think I need to," Frank said finally. "Not because I want to rekindle anything, but because I need to understand if I'm really ready to move forward." They met at Murphy's Cafe, the same place where Frank had waited 3 hours for a woman who never came and inadvertently found the family he was meant to have. Linda arrived precisely on time, looking exactly as Frank remembered, but somehow smaller, less significant than she had seemed during their marriage. She'd cut her hair shorter and gained a confidence that had been missing during their final years together. The self-assurance of someone who had found her authentic life. "You look good," she said, settling into the chair across from him. Rested, happy even, Frank realized she was right. The constant low-level exhaustion he'd carried since the divorce had lifted without his noticing, replaced by the energy that came from having purpose beyond mere survival. "I am happy," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Happier than I've been in years." Linda smiled, and it was genuinely pleased rather than polite. "I'm glad. I worried about you after I left. You seemed so lost." They talked for an hour about safe topics, Danny's job prospects, mutual friends, the changes in their small town since Linda had moved to the city. But beneath the surface conversation ran a deeper dialogue about forgiveness, acceptance, and the recognition that their marriage had ended not from cruelty or betrayal, but from the simple incompatibility of two good people who wanted different things from life. "I heard you're seeing someone," Linda said as they prepared to part ways. "Bobby Martinez's wife mentioned it when I ran into her at the grocery store." Frank felt a moment of irritation at small-town gossip, then realized he didn't care who knew about his relationship with Maya. In fact, he was proud to be associated with her courage, her dedication to Emma, her quiet strength in the face of overwhelming challenges. "Her name is Maya," he said. "She has a 5-year-old daughter named Emma. They're wonderful. Are you in love with her?" Linda asked, with the directness that had once been both attractive and frustrating during their marriage. Frank considered the question seriously, thinking about Maya's laugh when Emma said something particularly precocious, the way she fell asleep on the couch while doing data entry work, her fierce independence and equally fierce love for her daughter. "Yes," he said. "I am." Linda leaned across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. "Good. You deserve to be loved by someone who appreciates you exactly as you are." It was forgiveness and blessing wrapped in a simple sentence. The final closing of a chapter that had begun with teenage romance and ended with middle-aged wisdom. Frank drove home feeling lighter, as if he'd been carrying weight he hadn't realized existed. That evening, he found Maya and Emma in their usual Sunday routine, Emma coloring at the kitchen table while Maya prepared for the week ahead, organizing Emma's clothes, reviewing her work schedule, and mentally calculating how to stretch their resources until the next paycheck. It was a scene of modest contentment, but Frank now saw it with new clarity. "I love you," he said, the words emerging without preamble or preparation. Maya looked up from the lunches she was packing, her hands still for a moment as she processed what he'd said. Emma continued coloring, humming tunelessly to herself, oblivious to the significance of the moment. "I love you too," Maya replied quietly. "I have for weeks, but I was afraid to say it. Afraid you might think I was just grateful for your help." Frank crossed the small kitchen and took her hands in his, noting how her fingers trembled slightly. "I don't want your gratitude. I want your heart. You have it," Maya said simply. "You've had it since the night you followed Emma home and stayed to help a stranger." From the table, Emma looked up from her coloring book with the satisfaction of someone whose plans had finally come to fruition. "Does this mean you're going to marry Mommy now?" she asked. "Because I drew a picture of our wedding, and hopscotch is the ring bearer." Frank and Maya laughed, the sound mingling with Emma's delighted giggle as she held up her drawing, a crayon masterpiece featuring a tall figure in blue, Frank, a shorter figure in yellow, Maya, a small figure in purple, Emma, and a grey rabbit carrying what appeared to be a ring tied with ribbon. "We'll see about the wedding," Frank said, ruffling Emma's hair. "But yes, we're a family now." Emma nodded as if this had been obvious all along. "I know, I picked you specially for us." That night, after Emma had been tucked into bed with hopscotch and Maya had finished her evening work, Frank and Maya sat together on the couch that had served as her sickbed during their first meeting. The apartment felt different now, not just a place where Maya and Emma were surviving, but a home where all three of them belonged. "What happens now?" Maya asked, her head resting against his shoulder. Frank thought about the practical questions that would need answers, where they would live, how to blend their lives officially, whether Maya would return to nursing school. But beneath the logistics lay something more fundamental, the recognition that they had found something worth building together. "Now we figure it out as we go," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. One day at a time. It was the same approach he brought to mechanical problems, methodical, patient, willing to try different solutions until he found what worked. But this time he wouldn't be working alone. Emma's hand-drawn family picture had found its place of honor on Maya's refrigerator, held by magnets shaped like tiny tools that Frank had brought home from the auto parts store. The drawing depicted their unconventional family with the uncompromising honesty of a 5-year-old's perspective. Frank tall and solid in his blue work shirt, Maya smiling in her yellow waitress uniform, Emma dancing in her favorite purple dress, and Danny, who had been added in a later artistic session, standing protectively beside them all. Even hopscotch had been included, positioned prominently in the center as if he were the family's spiritual guardian. The picture had become a conversation starter during Danny's increasingly frequent visits. Frank's son, had initially approached the developing relationship with the cautious politeness of someone navigating unfamiliar social territory. But Emma's wholehearted adoption of him as her big brother had gradually worn down his reservations. Now he arrived most Sunday afternoons with small gifts, a new coloring book, a packet of seeds for the herbs Maya was trying to grow on the fire escape, a puzzle that he and Emma could work on together. "She's good for him," Maya observed one afternoon, watching through the window as Danny patiently taught Emma to throw a baseball in the small courtyard behind their building. "He's more relaxed when he's with her. Less serious," Frank nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. Danny had carried the weight of his parents' failed marriage with the stoic resignation that many children of divorce adopt, shouldering responsibility that wasn't his to bear. Emma's uncomplicated affection seemed to remind him that relationships could be sources of joy rather than anxiety. "He's good for her too," Frank replied. "She's never had anyone pay attention to her just for the pleasure of her company. Everyone else in her life has been paid to care for her or has needed something from her mother." It was a casual comment, but it highlighted one of the many ways that poverty had shaped Emma's young life. While other children took for granted the presence of adults who delighted in their existence, Emma had learned early that attention was a limited resource, something to be earned rather than freely given. The transformation in Maya had been equally profound, though more subtle than Emma's obvious blossoming. Frank watched her discover what it meant to share the load of parental responsibility, to have someone else worry about Emma's safety when she was running late from work, to come home to a dinner that someone else had prepared, and a daughter whose homework had already been checked. The constant tension that had been written across her shoulders began to ease as she learned to trust that Frank's presence in their lives was permanent rather than temporary. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," she confessed, one evening as they cleaned up after dinner, "for you to realize that this is more complicated than you bargained for and decide it's not worth the trouble." Frank paused in his dishwashing, understanding that her fear came from experience rather than paranoia. Emma's father had made promises about forever that had lasted exactly until the pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines. Maya's own father had disappeared when she was 7, leaving behind nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed. Every man in Maya's life had eventually reached a point where the responsibility outweighed the reward. "I'm not going anywhere," Frank said, turning to face her fully. "Not when things get difficult, not when Emma has teenage drama, not when we disagree about money or parenting or what to watch on television. This is what I want, Maya. This life with you and Emma, all of it." Maya leaned against the counter, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read between the lines of male promises. "Even when Emma decides she hates you because you won't let her have ice cream for breakfast. Even when I'm too tired for conversation because I've been studying all night. Even when your friends think you're crazy for taking on someone else's kid." "Especially then," Frank replied. "Those are the moments when families prove they're families. When staying is hard and people choose to stay anyway." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's appearance in the kitchen doorway, hopscotch tucked under one arm and a serious expression on her small face. "Are you having a fight?" she asked with the worried tone of a child who had learned to interpret adult tensions as potential threats to her security. "We're having a discussion," Maya said gently, kneeling to Emma's level. "Sometimes grown-ups need to talk about important things, like how much we love each other and how we want to be a family." Emma considered this explanation with the gravity she brought to all matters of family dynamics. "Are you going to get married like in my picture?" Frank and Maya exchanged a look over Emma's head. They had been moving toward that question for weeks, circling it carefully, like 2 people approaching something precious and fragile. "Would you like us to get married?" Frank asked Emma. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "Then you would be my real daddy, and we could all have the same last name, and nobody would ask me why my daddy doesn't look like me." It was a child's reasoning, but it carried the weight of real social pressures that Emma had already begun to navigate. Frank thought about the forms that would need to be filled out for school registration, the awkward conversations with other parents who would assume he was Emma's biological father, the simple relief of being able to introduce themselves as a family without qualification or explanation. "What do you think?" Frank asked Maya, his heart hammering with the significance of the moment. Maya looked at Emma, then at the refrigerator covered with her daughter's artwork, then at Frank, who was waiting for an answer that would determine the rest of all their lives. "I think," she said slowly, "that families are made by choice, not just by biology. And I choose you. We choose you." Emma clapped her hands with delight, already planning modifications to her wedding picture that would need to include Danny in a more prominent role, and perhaps give Hopscotch a tiny tuxedo. Frank felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced since Danny was small, and the future had seemed manageable and bright. The practical arrangements would take time. Frank's apartment above the garage was larger than Maya and Emma's place, but it would need modifications to accommodate a family. Emma would need her own room, decorated in whatever combination of colors and themes currently captured her imagination. Maya's few possessions would need to be integrated with Frank's functional bachelor belongings. Danny would need space for the visits that were becoming more frequent as he rediscovered the comfort of family dinners and shared responsibilities. But more challenging than the logistics would be the emotional work of becoming a family in the eyes of the law and the community. Frank would need to legally adopt Emma, a process that could be complicated by her biological father's unknown whereabouts and uncertain rights. Maya would need to navigate the social complexities of marrying a man she'd known for less than 6 months, while managing the judgment of people who might assume she was seeking financial security rather than genuine love. "People are going to talk," Maya said one evening as they discussed their engagement plans. "They'll say I'm using you, that you're having a midlife crisis, that we're moving too fast." Frank had already heard whispers around town, well-meaning friends expressing concern about his sudden commitment to a woman and child he barely knew. Suggestions that he was being taken advantage of by someone desperate enough to accept help from any available man. The gossip stung, not because he doubted his choices, but because it reduced their love story to a transaction. "Let them talk," he said. "They'll understand eventually, when they see how happy we are together." But privately, Frank worried about the pressure that outside judgment might place on their relationship. Maya was already sensitive about accepting help, already convinced that she was somehow taking more than she was giving. If the community narrative became one of rescue rather than love, it might undermine the equality that was essential to their partnership's success. These concerns seemed less important, however, when Frank watched Emma and Danny build elaborate structures with blocks, while Maya studied for the nursing program she had decided to re-enter. The scene was domestic in the best possible way. 3 generations finding joy in each other's company, each person both supported by and contributing to the family's shared life. Frank had never imagined that love could feel so practical, so grounded in daily routines and small kindnesses. His marriage to Linda had been built on passion and shared dreams that had gradually proven incompatible with real life. This relationship with Maya was different, rooted in mutual respect, practical compatibility, and the recognition that love was as much about choosing to stay as it was about initial attraction. "We're going to be okay," Maya said one night as they stood together in the kitchen. Emma finally asleep after an evening of excited wedding planning. "All of us. We're going to figure this out and be okay." Frank wrapped his arms around her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the faint smell of coffee that seemed to permanently linger on her clothes from her morning shifts at the diner. He thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. His failed marriage, her years of struggling alone, Emma's courageous decision to trust a stranger with her mother's life. "Better than okay," he said. "We're going to be happy." The knock on Maya's apartment door came on a Tuesday evening in November, 3 days before Frank and Maya had planned to apply for their marriage license. Emma was at the kitchen table working on a homework assignment about family trees, a SAISI project that had sparked considerable discussion about how to accurately represent their unconventional but deeply loved family structure. Frank was helping her navigate the complexities of step relationships and chosen family when the sharp, authoritative knock interrupted their domestic tranquility. Maya answered the door to find a man in an expensive suit, holding a briefcase and wearing the kind of confident smile that immediately put her on guard. He was tall, well-groomed, and carried himself with the easy assurance of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Behind him stood a woman with a clipboard and the official bearing of someone representing legal authority. "Maya Rodriguez?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm Richard Blackwell. I believe we need to talk about our daughter." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Frank, still seated at the kitchen table with Emma, felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees as he processed what he'd just heard. Emma looked up from her homework with the confused expression of a child sensing adult tension but not understanding its source. "Mommy, who is that man?" Emma asked, her small voice cutting through the sudden silence. Maya's face had gone pale, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Emma, why don't you go play in the bedroom for a few minutes while I talk to these people?" "But I'm not finished with my family tree," Emma protested, then looked directly at Richard with the frank curiosity that children possess. "Are you supposed to be in my family tree?" "Because I don't know you." Richard's practiced smile faltered slightly as he looked at the daughter he was seeing for the first time. Emma was undeniably beautiful, with Maya's dark eyes and delicate features, but there was something in the shape of her nose and the set of her chin that echoed his own genetics. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. "Hello, Emma," Richard said, crouching down to her level with movements that seemed calculated rather than natural. "I'm your father." "Your biological father." Frank felt his protective instincts surge as Emma's face scrunched with confusion. This was not how a child should learn about parentage, ambushed by a stranger making claims that threatened to upend everything she understood about her family. "I don't have a father," Emma said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that children bring to statements about their own lives. "Just Frank, who's going to be my daddy when he marries Mommy." The woman with the clipboard stepped forward, introducing herself as Patricia Lawson from the Department of Social Services. "We're here to discuss custody arrangements," she said briskly. "Mr. Blackwell has filed a petition for visitation rights and is prepared to discuss more permanent custody solutions." Maya found her voice, though it shook with barely controlled anger. "You can't just show up here after 5 years and claim rights to my daughter. You abandoned us. You wanted nothing to do with her when I told you I was pregnant." Richard's expression shifted to something that might have been genuine remorse, though Frank suspected it was another calculated response. "Maya, I was 23 years old and scared. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I've grown up since then. I'm successful now, established. I can provide for Emma in ways that..." He glanced around the modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and carefully maintained but obviously worn belongings. "In ways that would give her opportunities she deserves." Frank stood slowly, his hands clenched at his sides as he struggled to maintain control. This man was essentially arguing that love and stability mattered less than money, that the family they had built together could be dissolved because someone with more resources had decided to assert legal rights. "Emma doesn't need opportunities," Frank said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She needs security. She needs people who love her unconditionally. She needs a family that won't disappear when things get difficult." Richard turned his attention to Frank for the first time, assessing him with the cool evaluation of someone sizing up competition. "And you are?" "Frank Collins, Maya's fiancé and Emma's soon-to-be stepfather." "Ah." Richard's smile returned, but it had sharp edges now. "The mechanic." Maya always did have a thing for fixing broken things. The insult was delivered with casual cruelty. designed to make Frank feel inferior while simultaneously suggesting that Maya was attracted to men who needed repair rather than men who could provide for her. Frank felt his temper flare, but forced himself to remain calm for Emma's sake. Maya stepped between them, her own anger finally breaking through her shock. "Get out! Get out of my home right now. You have no right to be here, no right to upset my daughter, and certainly no right to insult the man who has done more for us in 3 months than you did in the entire year we were together." But Patricia Lawson was already pulling documents from her briefcase. "Actually, Ms. Rodriguez, Mr. Blackwell does have rights. He's the biological father, and while he hasn't been part of Emma's life previously, the court recognizes that people can change and that children benefit from relationships with both parents when possible." Frank found himself studying Richard more carefully, noting details that spoke to wealth and status: the Italian leather shoes, the watch that probably cost more than Frank's monthly income, the manicured hands that had never held a wrench or changed a diaper. This was a man who had built a successful life unencumbered by the responsibilities of parenthood, and was now ready to claim the rewards without having paid the costs. "What do you want?" Maya asked, her voice hollow with resignation. Richard opened his briefcase and produced papers that looked official and intimidating. "I want to establish a relationship with my daughter. I want regular visitation, input into major decisions about her education and health care, and eventually, I want to discuss custody arrangements that would give Emma access to the life I can provide for her." "The life you can provide," Frank repeated. "You mean the life where she gets moved away from everyone who loves her, to live with a stranger who decided to care about her existence when it became convenient? I mean the life where she attends private schools, has college fully funded, travels the world, and has every advantage that money can provide," Richard replied smoothly. "I've done well for myself, Maya, very well. I can give Emma things that—" He gestured vaguely at Frank and the modest apartment. "That this situation simply cannot." Emma, who had been listening to this conversation with growing distress, suddenly burst into tears. "I don't want a different life," she sobbed. "I like my life. I like Frank, and I like our apartment, and I don't want to go anywhere." Maya immediately scooped Emma into her arms, shooting murderous looks at both Richard and the social worker who had allowed this confrontation to happen in front of a confused and frightened child. "This is exactly what I mean," Richard said, as if Emma's emotional response proved his point rather than undermined it. "She's clearly been through trauma. She needs stability, professional guidance, and resources that can help her reach her full potential." Frank had heard enough. "You want to know about trauma? The trauma is a stranger showing up and threatening to take a child away from the only family she's ever known. The trauma is having your security threatened by someone who thinks parenting is a financial transaction." Patricia Lawson consulted her clipboard with the detached efficiency of someone who had witnessed too many family conflicts to be emotionally invested in any particular outcome. "Mr. Blackwell has filed the appropriate paperwork. Ms. Rodriguez, you'll need to respond within 30 days. I strongly recommend that you obtain legal representation." "Legal representation? I can't afford," Maya said bitterly, still holding Emma, who was crying into her shoulder. "There are resources available for people in your situation," Patricia replied. "Pro bono attorneys, legal aid clinics. The court wants what's best for Emma, and that includes ensuring that both parents have adequate representation." Richard was watching this exchange with an expression that might have been satisfaction. He had resources, connections, and the kind of legal firepower that could overwhelm a working single mother. Frank realized that this wasn't just about parental rights, it was about power, and the confidence that comes from knowing you can buy whatever outcome you prefer. "I'm not trying to be the villain here," Richard said, addressing Maya directly. "I know I hurt you. I know I made terrible choices when we were young. But Emma is my daughter too, and I have the right to be part of her life. I have the resources to give her opportunities that she'll never have otherwise. And if I fight you?" Maya asked. Richard's smile became genuinely warm for the first time, but it was the warmth of a predator who knew the hunt was already over. Then we'll let the court decide what's in Emma's best interests. A judge will look at my financial stability, my educational background, my ability to provide for her future, and compare that to— He gestured around the apartment again. Frank understood the threat perfectly. Richard wasn't just claiming parental rights. He was preparing to argue that Maya was an unfit mother because she was poor. He would present Emma's modest life as evidence of neglect, her mother's exhaustion as proof of inadequate care, their small apartment as a symbol of everything a child deserved to be rescued from. After Richard and Patricia left, the apartment felt smaller and more fragile, as if their sense of security had been revealed as illusion. Emma had finally stopped crying, but remained pressed against Maya's side, her small fingers clutching hopscotch with desperate intensity. "Is that man really my daddy?" Emma asked in a whisper. Maya looked at Frank helplessly, struggling to find words that would be honest without being terrifying. "He's your biological father. He helped make you. But Frank is your daddy in all the ways that matter. He loves you and takes care of you and wants to be part of your life forever. Will the judge make me go live with him?" Emma asked, her voice so small that Frank's heart broke a little more with each word. "We won't let that happen," Frank said, though he wasn't sure how they could make such a promise. "We're going to fight for our family." But privately, Frank was already calculating the odds and recognizing how steep they would be. Richard had money, status, and biological rights on his side. Frank was a small-town mechanic who had known Emma for 3 months. Maya was a single mother working multiple jobs who couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that might level the playing field. For the first time since Emma had taken his hand outside Murphy's cafe, Frank wondered if loving this family would be enough to keep them together. Frank found his military service medal in a cardboard box beneath old tax returns and forgotten Christmas cards, wrapped in the same tissue paper his mother had used when she'd presented it to him 27 years ago. The bronze star lay heavy in his palm, not because of its weight, but because of everything it represented. 18 months in Iraq as a combat engineer, nights spent disarming improvised explosive devices while other soldiers slept. The methodical courage required to approach death one wire at a time. He hadn't looked at the medal since Danny's 10th birthday, when his son had asked about the war stuff in Daddy's closet. Frank had explained briefly about serving his country, about the importance of duty and sacrifice, but he'd never felt comfortable with the hero worship that sometimes accompanied military service. He'd done his job, come home, and built a life that had nothing to do with sand and explosions and the particular terror of knowing that one wrong cut could end everything. Now, with Emma's custody hearing scheduled for the following week, Frank held the medal and remembered what it felt like to face impossible odds with nothing but skill, determination, and the absolute refusal to surrender. Richard Blackwell might have money and lawyers, but Frank had something more fundamental: the willingness to fight for what mattered, regardless of the cost. The past 3 weeks had been a crash course in family law, financial desperation, and the peculiar cruelty of a system that measured parental fitness primarily through economic metrics. Maya had barely slept, spending her evenings researching legal precedents and her lunch breaks consulting with overburdened public defenders who could offer sympathy but little hope. Frank had liquidated his modest savings account, cashed in his retirement fund, and taken out a loan against his garage to hire Jennifer Walsh, the best family attorney in a 50-mile radius. "I won't lie to you," Jennifer had said during their first consultation, reviewing the documents that Richard's legal team had filed. "He has a strong case. Biological father with established paternity, significant financial resources, clean criminal record, stable employment. The court tends to favor maintaining biological relationships when possible. What about abandonment?" Frank had asked. "He disappeared when Maya told him she was pregnant. Doesn't that count for something?" "It should," Jennifer replied. "But abandonment claims are harder to prove. when the father was very young and can demonstrate that he's matured and stabilized since then. Richard's attorneys are already building a narrative around youthful mistakes and personal growth. Maya had sat silently through most of the consultation, her face pale but determined. When Jennifer asked about her own case, her work history, living situation, support system, Maya answered with the exhausted honesty of someone who had nothing left to hide. I work 2 jobs now instead of 3, thanks to Frank's help. Emma has her own bedroom, excellent health care through my employment, and a stable routine. She's thriving in kindergarten, has friends in the neighborhood, and knows she's loved. But I can't compete with private schools and college funds and European vacations. Don't underestimate the value of stability and attachment, Jennifer had counseled. The court will consider Emma's own preferences, her existing relationships, and the potential trauma of separating her from her primary caregiver. Your job is to demonstrate that love and consistency matter more than money. But Frank knew that noble principles didn't always triumph in courtrooms, especially when one side could afford to present those principles with professional polish, while the other side scraped together legal fees, one overtime shift at a time. Richard's team would arrive with character witnesses, expert testimony, and a carefully constructed argument that Emma deserved opportunities that her current situation couldn't provide. Frank and Maya would have Jennifer their own testimony, and the hope that 5 years of devoted parenting would outweigh 5 minutes of biological connection. The community response had been more supportive than Frank had dared to expect. Bobby Martinez had organized a fundraiser at the hardware store, collecting donations that helped offset Jennifer's retainer. Grace from Murphy's Cafe had offered to testify about Frank's character, describing how he'd waited patiently for hours and then followed a frightened child into an unknown situation because it was the right thing to do. Even Linda had called, offering to provide a character reference that emphasized Frank's qualities as a father and partner. "You're good people fighting for something important," she'd said. "If there's anything I can do to help, just ask." Danny had taken a week off from his job to help prepare for the hearing, researching Richard's background and discovering inconsistencies that might undermine his credibility. Richard claimed to have been unaware of Emma's existence, but social media posts from 5 years ago suggested he'd known about Maya's pregnancy and had deliberately avoided contact. Financial records showed a pattern of supporting various charities related to children's welfare. Convenient for someone building a case about caring for kids, but suspicious given his complete absence from his actual child's life. "He's been planning this," Danny concluded after days of research. The charitable donations, the sudden interest in family values, even the timing of when he filed for custody. This isn't about Emma. It's about image management for someone whose career probably benefits from appearing to be a devoted father. Emma herself had become quieter since Richard's initial visit, her usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silences and questions that revealed her struggle to understand adult motivations. She'd drawn dozens of pictures in recent weeks, some showing their family of 4, others depicting scenarios where she lived in a big house with strangers, still others that seemed to be her attempts to work through the possibility of losing everyone she loved. "Will Hopscotch be able to come with me if I have to go live with that man?" she asked one evening while Frank helped her with a puzzle. "You're not going anywhere," Frank said firmly, though the words felt like promises he might not be able to keep. "We're going to fight for you, and we're going to win." Emma studied his face with the intensity that children bring to reading adult emotions. "Are you scared?" she asked. Frank considered lying, offering the kind of false reassurance that adults often give children to protect them from harsh realities. But Emma had already experienced enough adult failures to recognize dishonesty, and she deserved better than platitudes. "Yes," he said, "I'm scared. Not because I think we'll lose, but because you're important to me, and I don't want anything to hurt you." Emma nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I'm scared too. But Hopscotch says that being scared just means something matters a lot. And fighting for things that matter is what brave people do. Her 5-year-old wisdom carried more weight than most legal advice Frank had received. Being scared meant something mattered, and Emma mattered more than anything else in his life. The night before the hearing, Frank and Maya sat together in their kitchen after Emma had gone to bed, reviewing Jennifer's notes and trying to prepare for questions that would determine their family's future. Maya had taken the day off from both jobs, a financial sacrifice that emphasized how much was at stake. "What if we lose?" Maya asked quietly. "What if the judge decides that Richard can provide better for her than we can?" Frank reached across the table and took her hands, noting how they trembled with exhaustion and fear. "Then we appeal. We fight until there's nothing left to fight with. And if that's not enough, we make sure Emma knows she's loved, regardless of where she lives." "I keep thinking about when my father left," Maya said. "I was 7, old enough to understand that he chose to go. I've spent my whole life trying to make sure Emma never feels abandoned the way I did. But now someone might take her away from me, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." Frank thought about his own childhood, raised by parents who had stayed together through 43 years of marriage, who had modeled commitment and stability as natural states rather than achievements. He'd taken for granted the security that came from knowing his family was permanent, that love didn't have conditions or expiration dates. "Emma won't feel abandoned," he said, "because even if we lose the legal battle, we won't abandon her. We'll figure out visitation, we'll stay involved in her life. We'll make sure she knows that this isn't about her not being worth fighting for." Maya's tears came then, the exhausted, crying of someone who had been strong for too long and couldn't maintain the facade any longer. Frank held her while she sobbed, absorbing her fear and grief while struggling with his own sense of helplessness. He was a man accustomed to fixing things, but this problem couldn't be solved with tools and patience. This required faith in a system that often prioritized procedure over people, money over love. "We're going to be okay," he said, repeating words that had become a mantra during the week since Richard's appearance. "All of us. No matter what happens tomorrow, we're going to be okay." But as Frank lay awake that night, listening to Maya's restless sleep and thinking about Emma curled up with hopscotch in the next room, he understood that being okay might require redefining everything they thought they knew about victory, defeat, and the meaning of family. Tomorrow would determine whether love was enough to overcome law, whether their chosen family could survive challenge from biology and money. The Bronze Star sat on his bedside table, catching moonlight from the window and reflecting it back like a promise. Frank had faced death in a desert halfway around the world, had trusted his training and instincts to navigate situations where failure meant obliteration. This felt harder because the stakes were higher, not just his own life, but the happiness of 2 people who had become his entire world. But he'd been afraid before and had functioned anyway. He'd faced impossible odds and had found ways to succeed. Tomorrow, he would walk into that courtroom and fight for his family with the same methodical courage that had carried him through explosive devices and enemy fire. He would trust his training, his instincts, and his absolute refusal to accept defeat when protecting people he loved. Emma was worth fighting for. Maya was worth fighting for. Their unconventional, imperfect, deeply cherished family was worth whatever the battle would cost him. The courthouse smelled of old wood, industrial cleaning products, and the particular anxiety that accumulated in places where people's lives were decided by strangers. Frank sat beside Maya in the gallery, both of them dressed in their best clothes. His single suit that he wore to weddings and funerals, her navy blue dress that she'd borrowed from a co-worker, because her own professional wardrobe consisted mainly of waitress uniforms and cleaning clothes. Emma was not present, spared the trauma of witnessing the legal battle over her future, but her absence felt like a weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Frank kept thinking about her morning routine, how she always ate her cereal while standing at the kitchen counter, how she insisted on brushing Hopscotch's fur before leaving for school, how she'd hugged Frank extra tightly that morning and whispered, "Don't let them take me away. Richard sat across the aisle with his legal team. 3 attorneys in expensive suits who projected the kind of confidence that came from knowing they could overwhelm their opposition through sheer resources. He looked every inch the successful professional, clean-shaven, perfectly groomed, wearing a watch that probably cost more than Frank's monthly income. When he caught Frank's eye, he nodded with polite civility, as if this were a business negotiation rather than a fight for a child's future. Judge Margaret Harrison entered precisely at 9 o'clock, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and the efficient bearing of someone who had presided over thousands of family disputes. Frank studied her face, searching for signs of warmth or sympathy, but found only professional neutrality. This woman would decide Emma's fate based on law and precedent, not emotional appeals. Richard's attorney, a silver-haired man named Douglas Whitman, presented his case with polished efficiency. Richard had been young and irresponsible when Maya became pregnant, but he'd since built a successful career as a corporate attorney, maintained stable housing, and demonstrated his commitment to children through volunteer work and charitable donations. He could provide Emma with educational opportunities, financial security, and access to experiences that would expand her horizons, Your Honor, Whitman said, consulting notes that probably cost $100 per page to prepare. My client deeply regrets his absence from Emma's early life. He was 23 years old, fresh out of law school, and overwhelmed by responsibilities he wasn't prepared to handle. But people grow, Judge Harrison. They mature, they develop resources, and they recognize their obligations. Mr. Blackwell is now 33, financially stable, and ready to provide for his daughter in ways that her current situation simply cannot match. Frank watched the judge's face for reactions, but saw only careful attention to the legal arguments being presented. Jennifer had warned them that Judge Harrison was known for her strict adherence to precedent, her belief that children's best interests were usually served by maintaining biological relationships when possible. Whitman continued, presenting financial documents that demonstrated Richard's ability to provide for Emma's education, health care, and future needs. Private school tuition, college funds, travel opportunities, tutoring in languages and arts that would give her advantages in an increasingly competitive world. He painted a picture of a life where Emma would want for nothing material, where her potential could be fully realized through resources that Maya's modest income could never provide. We're not suggesting that Ms. Rodriguez has been negligent, Whitman said with the careful diplomacy of someone delivering calculated insults. She's clearly devoted to her daughter, but devotion alone cannot provide the opportunities that Mr. Blackwell can offer. Emma is an intelligent child who deserves every advantage we can give her. When it was Jennifer's turn to present Maya's case, Frank could feel the difference in resources immediately. Where Richard's team had bound presentations and professional exhibits, Jennifer worked from a single legal pad and a folder of documents that told the story of Maya's dedication through work schedules, school records and medical files that showed consistent, loving care, Your Honor, Jennifer began. This case isn't about financial resources. It's about attachment, stability, and the recognition that children thrive when they feel secure and loved. Emma Rodriguez has known one parent her entire life, her mother, Maya, who has sacrificed everything to provide for her daughter's needs. She has one home, one community, one support system. Mr. Blackwell is asking this court to disrupt that stability based solely on his biological connection and his ability to write larger checks. Jennifer presented Maya's work, documentation, timesheets that showed her dedication to providing for Emma, supervisors' evaluations that praised her reliability and character, medical records that demonstrated Emma's excellent health and development under Maya's care. She introduced character witnesses who testified about Maya's devotion, her involvement in Emma's education, her role in their neighborhood community. Frank listened to the testimony about Maya's character and felt his chest tighten with pride and fear. Everything they were saying was true, Maya was an exceptional mother. Emma was thriving under her care. Their family was built on genuine love and commitment. But he could see in the judge's face that emotional arguments were competing against legal precedents that favored biological relationships and financial stability. When Richard took the stand, he spoke with practiced sincerity about his regrets and his newfound commitment to fatherhood. He'd been scared and immature when Maya told him about the pregnancy, he admitted, but he'd spent the intervening years building the kind of life that could support a family. He'd been seeing a therapist to work through his abandonment issues, had read parenting books, had even taken courses in child development. "I'm not trying to take Emma away from her mother," Richard said, looking directly at the judge with earnest eyes. "I'm asking for the opportunity to be part of her life, to provide for her future in ways that complement what Ms. Rodriguez can offer. Emma deserves to know her father, and I deserve the chance to make up for my past mistakes." Frank wanted to shout that Richard's mistakes weren't accidents. They were deliberate choices to abandon a pregnant woman and refuse all responsibility for their child. But courtrooms weren't places for righteous anger, and Frank forced himself to remain silent while watching a man rewrite history to serve his current needs. Under cross-examination, Jennifer pressed Richard about his years of absence, his failure to pay child support, his complete lack of interest in Emma until now. But Richard had prepared for these questions, answering with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to verbal sparring. "I was wrong," he said repeatedly. "I was selfish and immature, but I've grown since then. I'm not the same man who walked away from my responsibilities." "And what changed?" Jennifer asked. "What suddenly made you interested in being a father after 5 years of complete absence?" Richard paused, and for a moment Frank thought he might reveal something honest and damaging. Instead, he delivered what was clearly a rehearsed answer. "I was diagnosed with a health scare last year. Thankfully, it turned out to be nothing serious. But it made me evaluate my priorities. I realized that I had a daughter I'd never met, and that life was too short to let pride and fear keep me from being the father she deserved." It was a compelling story, probably even partially true, but Frank recognized it as the kind of convenient epiphany that people experienced when the cost of change had become acceptable. Richard hadn't suddenly developed paternal instincts. He'd reached a point in his life where fatherhood seemed like an attractive accessory to his successful image. When Maya took the stand, Frank watched her transform from the exhausted single mother he knew into someone who radiated quiet strength and unshakable conviction. She spoke about Emma's birth, the difficult months of managing alone, the gradual building of a life that centered entirely around her daughter's well-being. "Emma is my world," Maya said simply. "Every decision I make, every job I take, every sacrifice I make is about giving her the best life I can provide. She's happy, healthy, loved, and secure. She knows who she is and where she belongs." Under cross-examination, Whitman attempted to paint Maya as well-meaning but limited, unable to provide the opportunities that a child deserved. He questioned her work schedule, her living situation, her ability to support Emma's future educational needs. "Ms. Rodriguez, you work 2 jobs to make ends meet, correct?" "Yes." "And you previously worked 3 jobs?" "Yes, until Frank began helping with expenses." "Mr. Collins, who you've known for approximately 4 months. Maya's jaw tightened. "Frank Collins, who followed my daughter home when she was scared and has been part of our family ever since. But you're financially dependent on a man you barely know?" Jennifer objected, but the damage was done. Whitman had successfully planted the suggestion that Maya's stability depended on the charity of a recent acquaintance, rather than her own resources. When Frank took the stand, he carried with him a folded piece of paper that Emma had given him that morning, a letter she had dictated to Maya the night before, written in her mother's careful handwriting but containing words that were unmistakably those of a 5-year-old trying to explain her heart to adults who seemed determined to complicate simple truths. Jennifer established Frank's character first, his military service, his successful business, his reputation in the community as someone reliable and trustworthy. She walked him through the evening he'd met Emma and Maya, emphasizing his immediate response to a child in need and his consistent commitment to their welfare over the months that followed. Mr. Collins, when Emma first approached you outside Murphy's Cafe, what was your initial reaction? Frank thought about that evening, how tired he'd been, how disappointed, how ready to retreat to his solitary life and never risk rejection again. I was confused at first, but then I saw how scared she was, and I knew I had to help her. When someone asks for help, especially a child, you don't turn away. And in the months since then, how would you describe your relationship with Emma? She's my daughter, Frank said simply. Not biologically, but in every way that matters. I love her, I worry about her, I want what's best for her future. She's changed my life completely and I can't imagine it without her. Under cross-examination, Whitman attempted to portray Frank as well-meaning but naive, a lonely middle-aged man who had confused gratitude with genuine family bonds. Mr. Collins, you were stood up on a date the night you met Ms. Rodriguez and Emma, correct? Yes, you were disappointed, perhaps feeling rejected? Frank saw where this was leading. I was disappointed that my date didn't show up, yes. And then a little girl approached you, asking for help, and suddenly you felt needed again. Jennifer objected, but Frank answered anyway. I felt responsible. There was a child who needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Isn't it possible that your feelings for this family are based more on your own need to feel useful than on genuine emotional attachment? Frank felt anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Mr. Whitman, I've been a father for 21 years. I know the difference between feeling useful and feeling love. I love Emma because she's funny and brave and kind. I love Maya because she's the strongest person I've ever met. Not because they need me, but because they've made my life better just by being in it. But it was Emma's letter that changed everything. Jennifer had requested permission to read it aloud, arguing that Emma's own voice deserved to be heard in proceedings that would determine her future. Judge Harrison had agreed, perhaps moved by the unusual circumstances of a 5-year-old attempting to advocate for herself. Your Honor, Jennifer said, unfolding the paper with reverent care. Emma Rodriguez asked her mother to write down her thoughts about this situation. With the court's permission, I'd like to read her words. Frank watched the judge's face as Jennifer began to read, looking for signs of how Emma's innocent perspective might influence someone trained to evaluate complex legal arguments. Dear Judge Lady, Jennifer read, her voice carrying Emma's earnest tone, even through adult pronunciation. My name is Emma, and I'm 5 years old. Some people are fighting about where I should live, and I wanted to tell you what I think, because it's my life, and I should get to help decide. The courtroom had gone completely quiet. Even Richard's attorneys seemed to recognize that interrupting a child's testimony would be both tactically unwise and morally questionable. I don't remember the man who says he's my biological father. I know what biological means, because Mommy explained it to me. It means he helped make me, but he didn't help raise me. Frank helped raise me even though he didn't help make me. I think helping raise someone is more important than helping make them, because making someone only takes one day, but raising them takes every day. Frank felt his throat tighten as Jennifer continued reading. Emma's logic, delivered with the clarity that children bring to complicated adult situations. Frank is my almost daddy. He reads to me and fixes things when they break and makes sure I eat vegetables, even when I don't want to. He taught me how to change the oil in his truck, and he always listens when I tell him about my day. When I have nightmares, he sits with me until I'm not scared anymore. When I drew a picture of our family, I put him in it because he belongs there. Judge Harrison was leaning forward slightly, her professional neutrality cracking just enough to reveal genuine attention to Emma's words. The man in the fancy suit says he can give me a better life with more money and big schools. But I already have a good life. I have Mommy, who loves me more than anything, and Frank, who chose to be my daddy even though he didn't have to. I have Danny, who is like my big brother, and Hopscotch, who protects me from monsters. I have friends at school and Grace at the cafe who always saves me extra whipped cream. Jennifer paused, looking up at the judge, before continuing with the final paragraph that Frank knew would either save them or break his heart. Completely. I know about divorce because my friend Sophia's parents got divorced and now she has to live in 2 different houses and she's always forgetting her homework at the wrong house. I don't want to live in 2 different houses. I want to live with Mommy and Frank and Danny and Hopscotch in our family. The biological father man seems nice, but he's a stranger, and I don't want to live with strangers, even if they have more money than my real family. The silence that followed Emma's letter felt sacred, as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath. Frank saw tears in Maya's eyes, noticed that even some of Richard's attorneys were looking uncomfortable with their case. The letter concludes, Jennifer said, with Emma's signature and a drawing of her family, which includes Mr. Collins, Ms. Rodriguez, Danny Collins, and a rabbit named Hopscotch. Judge Harrison studied the paper that Jennifer handed her, taking in Emma's careful signature and the crayon drawing that depicted their unconventional family with the uncompromising honesty of childhood art. When Richard's team presented their final arguments, they seemed less confident than they had at the beginning of the day. Whitman argued about resources and opportunities, about the importance of biological relationships and the benefits of financial stability. But Emma's letter had shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere, introducing the voice of the person whose welfare everyone claimed to be protecting. Jennifer's closing argument was brief but powerful. Your Honor, this case asks us to define what makes a family. Is it biology? Is it money? Or is it love, commitment, and the daily choice to put a child's well-being above your own convenience? Emma Rodriguez has a family. It may not look traditional. It may not have the most resources, but it's real and strong and built on foundation that has proven stable through every challenge they've faced. She gestured toward Frank and Maya, sitting together in the gallery. Mr. Collins didn't have to follow a frightened child home. He didn't have to stay and help a sick stranger. He didn't have to commit his heart and his resources to a family that wasn't legally his responsibility. But he chose to, because that's what love looks like. It looks like choosing people every day, not just when it's convenient or beneficial. Judge Harrison announced that she would recess to consider her decision. Standard procedure that nonetheless felt like suspended animation to everyone whose lives hung in the balance. Frank and Maya waited in the courthouse hallway, holding hands and trying not to read too much into the expressions of lawyers and court staff who passed by. Whatever happens, Maya said quietly, Emma knows she's loved. She knows we fought for her. Frank squeezed her hand, thinking about the little girl who was probably at school right now, working on her math worksheets and unaware that strangers in suits were deciding whether she would come home to the only family she'd ever known. He thought about her letter, about the wisdom hidden in her 5-year-old logic, about how clearly she understood what adults seemed determined to complicate. When they were called back into the courtroom 30 minutes later, Judge Harrison's face revealed nothing about the decision she'd reached. Frank felt his heart hammering against his ribs as she opened the folder containing Emma's future. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape multiple lives. This court finds that the best interests of Emma Rodriguez are served by maintaining primary custody with her mother, Maya Rodriguez, and recognizing the significant parental role that Frank Collins has assumed in her life. Frank felt Maya's hand tighten in his, but neither of them dared to breathe as the judge continued. While Mr. Blackwell has demonstrated his ability to provide financial advantages, this court recognizes that a child's welfare encompasses more than material resources. Emma has expressed a clear preference for her current living situation, has demonstrated strong attachment to her existing family structure, and would suffer significant emotional trauma from separation from her primary caregivers. Richard's face remained impassive, but Frank caught a flicker of something, disappointment perhaps, or the recognition that money couldn't purchase everything he wanted. However, Judge Harrison continued, this court also recognizes Mr. Blackwell's biological relationship with Emma and his stated desire to be part of her life. Therefore, the court orders supervised visitation rights, beginning with 2 hours every other Saturday in a neutral location, with the possibility of expanded visitation pending Emma's adjustment and comfort level. It wasn't complete victory, but it was enough. Emma would stay home, would continue to sleep in her own bed with hopscotch, would wake up every morning to the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. 6 months later, Frank stood in the small garden behind the house they had moved into together, a modest 2-story home with enough space for Emma to have her own room, for Danny to visit comfortably, and for Maya to set up a study area where she could complete her nursing degree. The garden was Emma's idea, inspired by the story of the brave rabbit that Frank had read to her during their first week together. Emma knelt between rows of tomatoes and lettuce, her small hands gentle as she watered plants that she had helped choose and nurture from seeds. Hopscotch sat nearby in the shade, presiding over the garden like a benevolent supervisor. At 6 years old, Emma had lost none of her determination or her uncanny ability to see simple solutions to complex problems. Frank, look, she called, pointing to a tomato that was just beginning to turn red. This one's almost ready for sandwiches. Maya emerged from the house carrying glasses of lemonade, her nursing school pin glinting on her uniform. She had graduated the previous month with honors, accepting a position in the pediatric ward at County General, the same department where she had done her clinical rotations years earlier. The circle felt complete in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Danny's truck pulled into the driveway, and Emma abandoned her watering can to run toward her big brother, who had driven down from the city where he worked as a construction supervisor. At 22, Danny had found his footing in the world, but he still came home most weekends, drawn by the warmth of a family that had grown rather than diminished over time. "Uncle Danny," Emma shouted, launching herself into his arms with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome. "Wait until you see how big our tomatoes got." The afternoon passed in the comfortable rhythm that had become their family's signature, Danny and Emma working together in the garden while Frank repaired a loose board on the back deck, and Maya studied for her continuing education requirements. It was ordinary in the best possible way, the kind of unremarkable happiness that people took for granted until they had lived without it. As evening approached, they gathered around the kitchen table that had replaced Maya's tiny one, sharing a meal that Emma had helped prepare and stories about their respective days. Emma chatted about her first-grade teacher. Danny described the apartment building his crew was constructing. Maya shared news from the hospital. And Frank listened with the contentment of someone who had found his place in the world. "Tell the story about how you found us," Emma requested, as she did most Sunday evenings when the family was complete and the week ahead felt manageable. It had become their origin story, the tale that explained how their unconventional family had formed. Frank obliged, describing the evening he had waited outside Murphy's cafe, the little girl who had appeared like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was making, the sick mother who had needed help but had given him so much more. "And then you followed me home," Emma added at the appropriate moment, "because you have kind eyes and kind people always help when someone asks." "That's right," Frank agreed, meeting Maya's smile across the table. "And we all lived happily ever after. Not ever after yet," Emma corrected with 6-year-old precision. "We're still living it." Later, after Emma had been tucked into bed with hopscotch and Danny had settled into his old room for the night, Frank and Maya sat together on their front porch, watching the neighborhood wind down for the evening. 3 simple gold bands sat on Maya's finger, her engagement ring, her wedding ring, and a 3rd band that Emma had insisted on, arguing that families should have symbols that included everyone. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Susan from the insurance office had actually shown up that night? Maya asked, her head resting against Frank's shoulder. Frank considered the question seriously, thinking about the alternate timeline where his blind date had arrived on time and he had never followed a frightened child home to an apartment that would become the center of his universe. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I remember that Emma was waiting for me specifically. She told you that God would send someone with kind eyes who was waiting alone. If Susan had shown up, I wouldn't have been waiting alone anymore. Maya laughed quietly. You think Emma orchestrated the whole thing? I think Emma knew what she was looking for, and she didn't give up until she found it. From the upstairs window came the sound of Emma's voice, talking quietly to Hopscotch about their plans for the next day's garden work. It was a sound that had become as familiar as breathing, as essential to Frank's sense of home as the smell of Maya's coffee or the sight of Danny's truck in their driveway. Richard's visits had settled into a predictable pattern, every other Saturday afternoon at the park, where he and Emma would walk around the pond and feed ducks while getting to know each other gradually. Emma approached these meetings with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she brought to most adult arrangements, understanding that Richard was part of her story without being central to her daily life. She called him Richard rather than any version of father, a distinction that seemed to work for everyone involved. He's nice enough, Emma had reported after one of their recent visits. He knows a lot about birds, and he brought me a book about different kinds of ducks. But he doesn't understand why I like gardening better than ballet lessons. It was Emma's way of saying that Richard remained a stranger who was slowly becoming an acquaintance, someone she could tolerate and even enjoy in small doses, but who would never compete with the family she had chosen and who had chosen her in return. As Frank and Maya prepared for bed, moving through the domestic rituals that had become second nature over the months of building a life together, Frank thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the loneliness of his apartment above the garage to the full-house chaos of a family that included a 6-year-old, a college graduate, and a new nurse who still brought work home but no longer worked 3 jobs to survive. I love our life, Maya said quietly, echoing his thoughts as she often did. Even the complicated parts, Frank asked, thinking about the legal bills they were still paying off, the adjustments that came with blending families, the everyday challenges of raising a child while building a marriage. Especially the complicated parts, Maya replied. Easy things don't mean as much as things you have to work for. Frank pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and thinking about the gas station flowers that had wilted in his hands during those 3 hours of waiting outside Murphy's cafe. Those flowers had been meant for a woman who had never existed except in his imagination. A fantasy of romance that bore no resemblance to the real love he had found with Maya and Emma. Real love, he had learned, looked like following a scared child home. It looked like choosing people every day, through sickness and legal battles and financial stress and the 1,000 small negotiations that families required. It looked like Emma's hand-drawn pictures on the refrigerator, and Danny's weekend visits and Maya's quiet strength in the face of challenges that would have broken other people. From down the hall came the sound of Emma's sleepy voice calling for water, and Frank automatically rose to fulfill the request, as he had done hundreds of times since becoming her almost daddy-turned-real daddy through adoption papers that had been finalized the month after their wedding. "I love you, Daddy," Emma murmured as he tucked her blankets around her and Hopscotch. "I love you too." "Sweetheart," Frank replied, words that had become as natural as breathing, as essential as the mechanical skills that had once defined his identity. Walking back to the bedroom he shared with Maya, Frank passed the kitchen table where Emma's homework lay ready for morning, her backpack packed with the care of a child who had learned to appreciate stability. On the refrigerator, her latest drawing showed their family gathered around this very table. Everyone smiling, everyone included, everyone exactly where they belonged. It was, Frank thought as he slipped into bed beside his wife, exactly the kind of happily ever after that happened to people who were brave enough to follow scared children home, patient enough to build love one day at a time, and wise enough to recognize that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as disappointments. Outside, the neighborhood settled into sleep, but inside their modest home, the family that had found each other through chance and chosen each other through love continued their quiet work of building a life together, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time.